Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is October 4th, a Friday around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about this Saturday upcoming and how it feels like it's a little too quiet. I think everyone kind of shares this sentiment at this point in the week, but I'm going to break down the couple of places that we could see a number of different chaos moves in this upcoming weekend. Then we'll get into a little bit of a week 6 wrap-up. We'll get into all of the different games that we haven't had a chance to get to throughout the week. We'll also get to the game that happened yesterday. Texas State gets a big win over Troy. Then we'll get a little bit of an update on all the questions I have going into week 6. I think one of the bigger ones is what's on the table in Tallahassee. Obviously, a lot of steam has been taken out of that matchup, but I think there's still a lot to play for in that matchup down there against Florida State and Clemson. Then I'll give you my best bets for this upcoming week. Definitely one that is really hard to get a beat on. As we'll talk about, it's going to be a little bit chaotic, so hard to get a beat on exactly where I want to go. But then we'll finish it off with all of the headlines we haven't had a chance to get to throughout the week. We'll make sure we update you with those at the end of the show. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat feature at the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page. Just click that $sign, add any question, comment you'd like, and we can have a fun back and forth about it. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that as you see fit. Also, GSMCpodcast.net is still up and running. That does the exact same thing. So either of those will work more than fine. Would love for you guys to get a little bit involved here. But let's get into this, because I think everyone kind of understands this at this point, but college football is one of those sports. When you have a ton of games that people aren't overly excited about, you don't have that marquee matchup that we probably should have in this week, but Florida State decided to do Florida State things. But at the end of the day, it's one of those weeks where nothing really jumps out. You know, you're not overly waiting for Saturday by any means. And then Saturday comes, and everything goes crazy. There's so many different upsets. There's tons of teams that are playing in games that you had no business playing in, to be totally fair, and I think it's going to be really, really incredible. There's a number of big-time games. I mean, there's an in-state rivalry down in Florida, UCF heading to Gainesville. There's a huge game for UNLV this upcoming weekend that could set them off on a G5 path, but at the end of the day, 9 ranked teams play on the road this upcoming weekend. It is going to be tough, and I believe 14 different teams play conference games on the road, or a lot of teams play conference games on the road, but at the end of the day, I believe there's a number of big-time teams that play conference games on the road. It's going to be really tough for them to deal with that, and we'll see how well they can go through it, but let's kind of get into this here for a second, and I'll break it down in no uncertain terms, all of the different areas that you could be looking at, kind of different upsets, and why they would be happening, in a sense at least, why they would be happening, not nitty-gritty, to be fair, but ranked teams that are taking on some dangerous teams is Oregon-Michigan State is a really interesting one. It's one that, frankly, I don't think a lot of Oregon fans are worried about it. I don't know if you should be worried about it. But at the end of the day, Aiden Childs on the other side of the field is one of those players that any given Saturday, he can play like an elite player in football. He absolutely can be one of those guys that totally takes over a game with his legs, makes a couple of big-time throws, and then you look up in the third quarter and Oregon's down 7 points. I don't expect that to happen, but going on the road to East Lansing is not an easy thing to do, and we'll figure out if they can handle it. Then you have Ohio State hosting Iowa. It's definitely one of those games that I don't know if anyone really trusts Iowa to score the amount of points that they need to. Maybe they have a little bit of that 2017 magic in them, but at the end of the day, I think there's one of those games that we don't really know who Ohio State is yet. I feel pretty good that they're a very, very good elite team that absolutely can win a title, but they haven't really been tested yet. Obviously, going up to Michigan State was a little bit of a test. This is going to be a huge one, no two ways about that. And then you do have Georgia facing off against Auburn, another one where Georgia just needs to respond. There were holes in that Alabama game that were exposed that Auburn could very well expose as well, but you have to make sure you come ready and then you see if you can take care of business. I think they will, but definitely one of those games that Auburn's going to come in ready, and they have a little bit of momentum going on around there. Then you have Boise State hosting Utah State. You have Iowa State inviting Baylor, which is an interesting one to watch out there. Then you have Penn State with UCLA. It's one of those things where none of those games really jump off the page. None of those games you worry about an upset happening, but one absolutely could happen in that group. And then you got the teams that are heading out west, and Michigan-Washington is the one that I want to talk about first because we covered this one. I do think Michigan's going to win. It's going to be a nightmare to deal with. I can absolutely promise you that. Pretty much any game that Michigan has going forward is going to be a nightmare to deal with just by the way that they game plan, the way they go about business. You're not going to blow out a lot of people. You're going to have a really tough time scoring a ton of points. and that means your heart rate's going to be very, very high throughout these games. But they are underdogs going on the road all the way out to Seattle. We'll see how they handle it. I have them winning, but one of those games that's going to be really fun to watch in that night slate. Miami heading all the way out to Cal is another one that I've talked about a number of times this week. I think Cal's trying to take advantage of the opening that the VT game gave them. Maybe Miami comes in a little bit sluggish, and like I talked about yesterday, this game is very, very close at halftime and maybe gets a little bit more interesting in the second half. And then you have UNLV-Syracuse, and I think this one's going to be tough to figure out. I think tonight's going to be an incredible matchup. We'll talk about it in a little bit more detail later, but I think when you talk about the ACC races, the G5 CFP race, this is a huge game. Syracuse obviously took a tough loss to Stanford last week, but they're still a very capable team, and at the very least, could be one of those teams that anytime they face off against a Clemson, a Miami, they're pretty much the two elite teams in that conference. Once they face off against those teams, they can just play elite football on one Saturday and get a huge win. So all three of those games, I think it's something that we're going to get something out of those games. We are going to get some juice out of Michigan, some juice out of Miami, some juice out of UNLV-Syracuse. Frankly, I think all three of those games are going to be absolutely incredible. They'll be incredible for different reasons. Michigan-Washington might be a little bit tougher of a watch, but at the end of the day, I think it's three games that maybe those ranked teams just have a little bit of trouble getting over the hump they need to. Then you got the hostile environment crowd, and Ole Miss leads this off, and it's an absolute nightmare for them to find themselves in this spot going into this week because Columbia, South Carolina is not going to be easy to deal with. I can absolutely promise you that. I've talked about this game a lot. I'm picking South Carolina in it. I fully believe that South Carolina's defensive line is going to be just too much for Ole Miss to handle. I think Ole Miss is not running the ball nearly as much or as effectively as they should. I just think it's going to be a really, really tough matchup at the worst possible moment for Ole Miss. So I don't necessarily love that moment. They're going to have to execute at a really, really high level in a very tough environment a week after they didn't necessarily execute very, very well. So it's going to be a really interesting game, one that I know a lot of people are circling out there, and maybe Ole Miss's season just essentially comes to an end on Saturday, which would be crazy to figure out. But then you got Tennessee at Arkansas. Tennessee hasn't played in 13 days. This is going to be a tough reintroducing to college football. No two ways about that. But obviously got a huge win on the road at Oklahoma for their last game. It's one of those that you don't really worry about this Tennessee team, but there's always that moment. For pretty much every team in the country, there's always that moment where you put up a little bit of a stinker on the road, especially in the SEC, and you look up and you have a number of things to fix on Monday, which very well could be what happens here. And then you got Indiana Northwestern. This is one that should worry the Hoosiers less, but the reality is 14 points makes me a little bit nervous. Also, I think when you have Indiana in the position that they're in, they're just trying to stay undefeated. They're probably always on edge, to be totally fair, because this season is so important. You have so many things going in the right direction. This would be the game that would totally bury you and totally send you back to square one, or it obviously would kickstart you into a really good end of the season that is a pretty favorable schedule. So it's one of those things that you could say, well, Ole Miss is bound to bounce back, or no way Tennessee or Indiana falls to Arkansas or Northwestern. It's one of those things. We can't really necessarily use logic here. We have to necessarily use what college football gives us, which is outright chaos pretty much every single week. Then you got the conference race definers. You got a couple of big-time games this upcoming weekend that will have something to say with how these conferences shake out. Obviously, the big-time one is Missouri A&M. That is going to be one that, at the very least, will give you an idea of who that second tier of the SEC is. I think everyone feels pretty good saying Alabama, Texas, Georgia, Tennessee are the elite teams in that conference. Then you have Ole Miss, you have Missouri, you have a couple other teams right around there. I think the winner of this game would be firmly in that second group. I think they'd be a very dangerous team going forward and would obviously be a huge win for especially Missouri with the schedule they have coming up. Then you got SMU Louisville, and I think when you talk about this one, the ACC is just wide open. There's no one that really has a total beat on that conference. Obviously, Clemson and Miami have started to separate, but that could change in a hurry. Obviously, it could change on Saturday with a couple of interesting games coming up for those teams, but it's one of those games, kind of like that Missouri A&M one, where you got to have that second tier somewhere. You got to have that third team, that fourth team that's in that conversation. The winner of this game is likely that team. And then you do have Rutgers, Nebraska. I think it's one of those games, kind of like Louisville, SMU, where maybe it's not a team that's going to compete for the Big Ten. absolutely a team that could really push a lot of the elite teams and also possibly be in that conversation at the very least towards the end of the season. So it's one of those games that maybe doesn't jump off the page in terms of the names on it, but absolutely we'll have a lot to say. And then you have a ton of group of 5 games that are going to have a ton to say. I think Texas Tech, Arizona, Iowa, Ohio State are going to have a number of things to say about what their conference is this upcoming year. And then finally, you got just the college football moments, the ones that you would never expect to happen, the ones that you do not expect to happen, but end up sneaking up on you. And I think you have Alabama at Vandy. Probably shouldn't happen, but at the end of the day, coming off a huge emotional win, maybe Alabama's a little bit sluggish to start that one. USC against Minnesota, I just think isn't a great matchup for USC. I think it's going to be really, really tough for them to deal with a team that can run the ball very effectively, but also can hit that deep shot every once in a while, unlike what Michigan could do. So it's going to be really interesting to see that one develop. And then obviously you have Clemson, Florida State. Frankly, one that should not be one that we're confused about or one that we're not necessarily super excited about. But here we are. Clemson should be able to handle business. Frankly, I think they should be able to blow out Florida State. And if they don't, then maybe we have some questions. But at the end of the day, it's 3 games that you probably aren't picking the underdog to win it by any means, but absolutely could be one that develops into that in a hurry. So it's going to be really, really fun to watch all of this unfold. I think it's one of those things that we've had a top 10 team fall in a number of different weeks this season. I think the only week we didn't was week 3, and that was a week where Missouri really struggled. So it's one of those things that there's not an off week in college football. There's not a week where you can say, I'll do what I need to do this weekend. I'll make plans with my girlfriend so they feel a little bit better about the rest of the season. Or, I'm going to take a little bit of time off, relax on Saturday. I promise you're going to miss out on some big-time games. You're going to miss out on some games that are going to have a lot to say about the rest of the season, and we'll see how it develops going forward, but I just think it's one of those things. You don't want to show up to work on Monday and say you missed the big-time game. So it's going to be a crazy weekend. It's one of those that is going to lull you to sleep and then punch you in the face. It's going to be really, really fun. So definitely strap in, be very excited about this upcoming one, because I think it's going to be one that we remember for quite some time, at least in this season of college football. But let's take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to break down all the games we just haven't had a chance to get to yet, including that game that happened yesterday, Texas State, a huge win over Troy. We'll break it all down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about this upcoming weekend and how there's probably going to be a little bit more chaos than we see coming, and definitely one of those things that just happens in college football. So be on the lookout for that, but let's get into all the games we just haven't had a chance to get to throughout the week. Definitely some big time ones that obviously this week, not necessarily that marquee game, plenty of games that are going to be really, really fun to watch, and we got a good one yesterday. Texas State is a real team. They're so much fun to watch. One of those teams, Jordan McLeod running the offense very, very efficiently. Jaden Williams is an absolute star on the outside along with Joey Hobart. You have Ishmael Mahdi, incredible running back, along with Torrance Burgess Jr. This team is as elite as it gets on the G5 level. I think they might just be on a collision course with JMU in the Sun Belt. They have a huge game at the end of the year against South Alabama. That's going to be one worth watching. I can absolutely promise you that. Jordan McLeod against Gio Lopez is going to be tons of fun to watch, and very well could send them into the playoff or into the championship for the Sun Belt from the West. So it's going to be really, really fun to watch this team unfold. Had 252 through the air, 215 on the ground, held Troy to 1.9 yards per carry. If that's the way they're going to go about business, they're going to be really, really tough to beat. If they can run for over 200 and hold you to, I believe the number ended up being somewhere in the 60s, if that's the way they're going to go about business, they're going to be nearly impossible to beat in this conference. They're an absolutely elite team. G.J. Kinney's done an incredible job with that entire program, and especially that offense right about now, it is so much fun to watch. So anytime you turn on Texas State, I can almost promise you're getting a little bit of a show, and you very well could be watching the team that ends up being that Group of 5 participant. They do have 2 losses on the season, so a little bit tougher of a path, but if they roll the rest of the way like this, then they very well could be one of those elite G5 teams. Then you got an elite game tonight. I cannot wait for this game. It's a game that we've touched on a little bit this week, but it deserves its own shine here. I think it's one of those games that you have UNLV with as much energy as really anyone in the country right about now, and then Kyle McCord trying to just get his season a little bit back on track after a very tough performance against Stanford. I still think they have a chance in the ACC race. Obviously, Clemson and Miami have started to kind of pace themselves. Let's say Clemson just isn't quite the team that we have seen the past couple of weeks. Let's say they go into Clemson, go into Florida State, only win by 6-10 points, and we come out of it being like, okay, maybe Clemson was a little bit closer to week 1 than the last couple of weeks. So could be a really interesting conference. If Syracuse wins this game, then I have a little bit of confidence going with them going forward. I think Stanford's one of those teams that you can't necessarily count out a team because they lose to Stanford, because they're such a weird team to deal with. So it's one of those games that I just think we're going to have a ton of fun. I think there's going to be points on the board. I think Haj Malik Williams, whenever you watch him on the field, it is a special thing to witness. And then you got a team in Syracuse that is really fighting for their lives in some ways in this game. Then you got another ACC matchup. That team we just talked about, Stanford, is taking on Virginia Tech. They're hosting Virginia Tech, so another team that's heading all the way out west for their first conference matchup. And it's going to be a tough one. No two ways about that. Virginia Tech coming off a very, very tough loss to Miami, one that I'm absolutely certain they feel like they should have won, and they feel like they got kind of screwed out of a call. So it's one of those things that they got to be coming into this one with energy, or they could be coming to this one a little bit defeated. We'll figure out what that team is on Saturday. And then Ashton Daniels is becoming one of the more fun quarterbacks in the entire country. And it's kind of because he's a threat all over the field, but also he likes to throw the ball to the other team from time to time. So kind of makes it for a fun college football game at the end of the day. I think Virginia Tech is one of those teams that I think they found something offensively last week. It's obviously not something that is going to be, consistent week over week, because a lot of it was broken plays. Doesn't change that I think they found a little bit of a groove. I think Baishal Tootin is finding himself, and I think it'll be tough for Stanford to get this one done. That being said, with the travel factor and everything going into this game for Virginia Tech, maybe they just slip up again. Then you got a conference matchup in the Big 12, and I think people have counted out Oklahoma State, and I kind of understand that, if I'm being totally fair going forward. The thing is, I don't think West Virginia's out of it. They have 2 losses. They're both out of conference to Penn State and Pitt in a fashion that, frankly, they shouldn't have lost. But at the end of the day, they're in a position where they very well could still be in the Big 12 race. They need a big-time win here at Oklahoma State, and Oklahoma State seemed like they kind of found Ollie Gordon in the last game, at least early on in that game, and then it obviously got away from them. They had to start passing the ball more, but maybe this is one of those games that he actually breaks out. He becomes, he is a premier back in this sport. He's got to prove it up this upcoming weekend, and West Virginia is a very solid defense. So we'll figure out what they can do. I think West Virginia is one of those teams that you haven't seen what you wanted to see from them by any means, but with Garrett Green, with all of those guys on that team, I still think they have an ability to make a little bit of a run. It would just have to start on Saturday or on tomorrow against Oklahoma State. Then you got another one in that conference, and this one is a little bit sketchy for Iowa State. They have to be very, very careful in this one. Baylor obviously coming off a couple of losses that just really hurt. Colorado on that crazy play at the end by LeJontay Wester, and then BYU, you come all the way back and then barely lose in that game. So it could be one of those things that if they fall in this one, then we know the fate of Dave Aranda going forward. We know the fate of this team going forward. Don't want that to happen by any means, but that's kind of the reality of where they're standing right about now. I do think Iowa State's one of those teams that, why can't they be the top team in the conference? I think we're spending so much time talking about Utah when Cam Rising is back. Frankly, I don't know when that's going to be. And KSU, a very, very good team, they've been a little bit inconsistent. Iowa State's been the team that showed up every single week, played elite defense, taking care of the ball. Rocco Becht is making his next step forward, and they're doing a lot of really fun things with that offense. I think they have so many weapons. Abu Sama is going to be a dangerous player throughout the rest of the season. They have an elite duo in Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel. they're going to be a really fun team. And frankly, I have them as my top team in the conference, at least in terms of ranking. They are the number one team in the conference. I would have them as my favorite to make this the conference championship as of right now. But it's one of those games that I think the Big 12 is going to be defined by this year, where you have a team that probably shouldn't get a win going into another environment and then comes out with a win miraculously. So Iowa State's got to make sure they handle business, and if Baylor doesn't, then I think we kind of know what Dave Aranda is going to look like at the end of the season, probably looking for a job somewhere. And then you got the in-state rivalry in Florida going on this weekend. One game that a lot of air has been taken out of the balloon in this one, I can promise you that. But UCF obviously getting rolled last week by Colorado put them in a really interesting position. They are not necessarily out of the race in the Big 12, but a lot of people have kind of put them there for the time being, and probably I have as well. We'll see what happens in this game, but Florida is in a really weird spot just the rest of the season. I think they're one of those teams, kind of like Florida State, which we'll talk about here in a bit, but it's one of those teams where you're having a nightmare season. No one's here to tell you that you're not. I think wins over UCF and FSU could kind of salvage this nightmare, make them feel a little bit better about where they are, a little bit better about where they're standing going forward. Obviously, I don't think Billy Napier is going to be the head coach going forward. That being said, you got to show a pulse. You got to show that these players really care. You got to show that this, putting on that uniform still means something to these kids, and they go out there and get big-time wins in these type of games, in these rivalry games where you're going to have a lot of people in the state of Florida, a lot of recruits in the state of Florida watching this game. Make sure you prove a point in it. And then for UCF, you have a shot to get back in the Big 12 race. You took a very, very tough loss a week ago to Colorado. You get a big-time win here. You move back on into the Big 12 game. Maybe things get a little bit more interesting. But it's one of those games that I like Florida in it. I do think Florida's kind of finding a little bit of a level in this season, kind of finding their groove just a little bit. Not necessarily an elite groove by any means, but definitely a team that is finding it just a little bit more. And UCF, I don't know what they're going to do with KJ Jefferson at quarterback. He can't really throw the ball downfield. They're not getting the run game going nearly enough, and Florida's going to do everything they can to stop that run game, the same way Colorado did. So it's going to be a really tough matchup for UCF. I do like Florida in it, but one of those games that could set up one for really elite success, could set up the other for just an absolute disaster season. Then you got another Big 12 matchup out there. Kansas-Arizona State is so interesting to me. It's one of those games where it's going to be a really fun Big 12 game. I'm not sure how much either of these teams is really going to factor into the end of the year. If you really like running the ball, if you like run fit, if you like scheming up runs and elite running backs, go to this game. You have Devin Neal, Daniel Highshaw, one of the most underrated duos of the bunch in the entire country on the Kansas roster. And then you got Cam Scadaboo on the other side. It's going to be so much fun to watch these two offenses go at each other. And I think it's one of those games where neither of these teams are really going to factor into the Big 12 race. I feel pretty confident saying that. That doesn't change they have a lot to play for, especially for Kenny Dillingham. You're still trying to build what you have over there. And then for Lance Leipold, you're just trying to make these fans feel a little bit better about what the season is. Obviously not the season that you wanted, and it's probably not going to be the going forward, but at the end of the day, getting a win like this at least makes them feel a little bit better about where they stand, and then you can move forward, try to rebuild this thing at least in 2025. So going to be a really fun matchup, one of those that is going to sneak under the radar. Maybe you look up late in this game, and it's an absolute shootout back and forth, so much fun to watch. And then finally, my most fun game of the week, frankly, and it's at 11 p.m. on Saturday, as it often, frankly, is. But Texas Tech, Arizona is going to be tons of fun to watch. Arizona favored by 6.5 right now, and it's a huge game in the Big 12. And frankly, I didn't necessarily peg it as a huge game in the Big 12 once we got to this time of year, but Texas Tech is 2-0 in conference play. Only two other teams are with them, and that's BYU and Colorado. So just to give you an idea of where the Big 12 is standing right now. And then Arizona is trying to bounce back after, well, they were able to bounce back after a KSU loss, got a huge Utah win. Got to continue it into this one. If they can get this win, then maybe they're back in that conversation for the Big 12. If Texas Tech gets it, then they might be one of the most dangerous teams in the conference. They have every ability to compete with pretty much every team in this conference. I think Taj Brooks is finding his groove. They have an underrated wide receiver duo. They have so many elite wide receivers on that team. And then you got a quarterback in Bear Morton that is slowly finding himself in that offense. It's going to be tons of fun to watch this one unfold. I think when you have T-Mac and Noah Fafita on the field, you feel pretty good. You're going to get some points in this one, and I feel pretty good that we're going to get some points in this one. It's going to be a really fun matchup. I think I'd lean Arizona in it, but I'm not necessarily super gung-ho about that. I think any game in the Big 12, frankly, if you pick with a lot of confidence, you might just be a little bit crazy. It's going to be incredible to watch this game unfold, and whoever comes out on top is definitely looking at Arlington as a very real possibility this year. This week is going to be really fun. I think it's one of those weeks where obviously you don't have the marquee matchups that you love to have. You have a ton of matchups that are right in that second, third tier that are going to be so much fun to watch. So cannot wait for those. Obviously, we'll break them all down on Monday's show, but let's take our second break here. And when we come back, we're going to get to all of the questions I have for this upcoming weekend. One of the bigger ones I have is what's actually on the line down there in Tallahassee this upcoming weekend between Clemson and Florida State, because obviously it's not necessarily an ACC title by any means. So we'll break it all down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all of the games we just hadn't got a chance to get to throughout the week. Some really fun games in that bunch, especially out in the Big 12. Feels like a huge week over there, but let's get into all the questions I have going into this upcoming weekend. I got a lot of them because there's so many different ways that this week could go. There's so many different variables going into it that it's really hard to get a beat on all of this. But let's jump in here, and we'll start with who has the most to prove this upcoming weekend. I think those two teams on your screen are probably the top two, if we're being totally honest. Obviously, a ranked matchup going on in College Station. Both these teams have every ability to become a college football playoff hopeful. A&M walks out of this game with one loss with a huge win over Missouri. They obviously have Alabama. They have Texas at the end of the year. You split those games, you have every ability to get in, and you have a really tough schedule. Maybe you need Notre Dame to kind of kick it up a notch a little bit, but say you lose both those games. Maybe you're the first 9-3 team that they think about. And then on the Missouri side, your schedule is not very hard coming forward. You do have to go to Tuscaloosa, which is going to be a battle I don't necessarily expect you to win, but at the end of the day, you can drop that one and maybe one other, and you can still get into the field. I think Missouri is one of those teams that this was probably going to be the game from pretty much the start of the year, and here we are. They got to be able to execute on Saturday. And then you got Georgia. Obviously, Georgia coming off that really tough loss from a week ago. Frankly, they haven't been in this position in a very long time. Since 2020, when South Carolina beat them at home, they have not lost a regular season game. We'll see what this team's about. We'll see what Kirby Smart's team is really about in 2024. I tend to believe that they're going to be fine, and I think a lot of people share that sentiment, but it's going to be one of those matchups that, at the very least, will give us an idea of how mentally tough Georgia is after that really tough loss. Then you obviously have Ole Miss, another team that did take a loss, but it was a little bit more embarrassing than what Georgia took, to be totally honest. It's one of those things that this was a team that came in with all the hope in the world. So many great transfers, elite quarterback coming back for his third year, so many weapons on the outside, and they just got physically beat. It didn't matter how many weapons they had on the outside. It didn't matter, how many dynamic players they got on defense. The offense didn't execute because that defensive line for Kentucky just ate them for dinner. They have to be able to show that they can hold up to that. And South Carolina is going to give you another good test because they're a very physical front as well. If you can hold up and, win this one by 14 points, make everyone feel a little bit better about where you are, they probably rocket back up into my top 10. The thing is, I got to see it to believe it. I'm very worried about this team. I do have South Carolina winning it. So it's going to be a really fun matchup, but it's one of those that Ole Miss's season could effectively end on Saturday. I don't like saying that because obviously the CFP isn't the end-all be-all, but if you were to ask a Ole Miss fan, they probably would share that sentiment. And then you have some couple others. I think UNLV's got to make a point this upcoming weekend, but the other thing I want to talk about, what's on the table in Tallahassee this upcoming weekend? This game has been just kneecapped in the worst possible way since the beginning of the year. I think everyone felt like going into this game, we were going to be deciding who was going to be in Charlotte. It wasn't necessarily that both these teams were going or the winner of it was outright going to win the conference, but it felt like whoever won this game was going to be in a shoe-in to possibly meet Miami in that championship game. It's weird because I still think this is a huge game for Clemson. I still think this is a chance to go on the road for the first time since that Georgia game, prove your point that you are still an elite team in this conference, and show that the past couple of weeks is a little bit more indicative of who you are in 2024 than that first week against Georgia. So I still think there's a lot on the table here. I think Cade Klubnik is one of those players that has so much momentum rolling downhill. Is definitely one of those guys that he's probably playing the second best, at least in terms of quarterbacks, the second best in the ACC right now. So he's playing really good football. He's got to be able to do it on the road against a defense that is going to be the toughest test that he's faced thus far. It's going to, or not thus far, but outside of Georgia thus far. It's going to be really, really fun to watch this one unfold, and I think it's going to be one of those games that Clemson has just about everything to lose, and the team you're playing has absolutely nothing to lose. Brock Glenn is going to get the start for Florida State in this game with DJU being out with a broken finger. It's going to be really interesting to see how this kid handles it, because there's been a lot of fans that have been yelling about benching DJ, and he hasn't been put in the game until DJ got hurt. So can't necessarily be a ton of confidence that he's going into this game with, but at the end of the day, it's one of those games that can totally flip this season on its head. You know, Florida State is not going to be good this year. I feel very confident in saying that. The thing is, you get this one big win over Clemson, you can sell that for quite some time on the recruiting trail, and that very much matters for Florida State. They need every single chip they can possibly use in the recruiting world right now, and they have zero. So getting this win on Saturday would mean the world to them. So obviously, some juice has been taken out of this matchup, no two ways about that, but the way I look at it, I still think it's huge for both teams, just in very, very different circumstances than we thought going into the season. Then you got a couple of top 10 teams that I just think are in a little bit of danger this upcoming week. Top 10 team has fallen every single week except for week 3, and that was when Missouri just barely escaped Boston College. So it's going to be a really fun week. I feel like we're going to get at least one top 10 team that goes down, and Missouri would obviously be the easy answer here. Going on the road to A&M is never going to be easy. I do have my worries about that offense. I think some of the things that I was worried about have been kind of talked out of, but just by the way that some defenses were facing them. But at the end of the day, I do think this is a really tough matchup for them going on the road for the first time in the year. I do have A&M winning it. I feel a little bit worse about that now than when I made it, but at the end of the day, I am going to roll with the Aggies here. I think it's one of those games that Missouri just might not be all the way ready for as of right now. Oh, excuse me, I got this back-to-back. Now we'll talk about Michigan here because they're an underdog heading into Seattle this upcoming weekend for the title rematch. They very badly need to win this game. I think it's one of those games that everyone's just kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop for Michigan. They're waiting for them to put up an absolute stinker, lose one of these games that they've been able to escape with, and possibly, you know, everyone gets to bury them a little bit more. But at the end of the day, I think they're one of those teams that's just going to be really tough to get out. I think they're going to be a really tough team to just get a beat on by any means, and especially for a team like Washington that I don't think is all that terrifying of an offense. I don't think they're going to be able to do what USC did. I don't think they're going to be able to do what Texas did, obviously. But at the end of the day, it's definitely a sketchy game. It's one of those games that Michigan's going to have to come prepared, and frankly, they got to be prepared for every single game coming forward because they don't have it nearly as explosive of an offense to feel good about games right now. So it's going to be really interesting to watch this one unfold. I think when you talk about this Michigan team right now, you can't feel great when they go on the road ever. You can't feel great really when they play anyone ever right about now. But I tend to believe they'll take care of business. I don't feel great about that by any means. And then you got a number of other ones. You got Tennessee on the road at Arkansas, going to be a really interesting matchup just to see where the Vols are after that bye week. And then Miami going on the road, we talked about Ohio State hosting Iowa, Georgia playing Auburn. There's plenty of big-time games that possibly could go the other direction, and maybe we do have one of those, probably not NIU level losses, but maybe we do have a little bit of an upset in the top 10 this upcoming weekend. And then we got a travel that is going to play a big part in this upcoming weekend. My wonder is, does Vegas kind of bake in travel a little bit more aggressively after this weekend, regardless of the results? Because I think when you're talking about Miami, Michigan, Virginia Tech, and then multiple others that are heading out west this upcoming week, we don't really know what that's like. I think there are a number of examples of, people doing this in an out-of-conference game early in the season, or doing this in week 1 with LSU going all the way out to play USC. The reality is, this is a conference game in the middle of the week. A lot of these teams played on Saturday. They flew out probably on Wednesday, Thursday, and now they got to play again. It's going to be really tough to deal with. I mean, you talk about even the practice schedule from, let's say, Miami, who had more time than most of these teams. They probably got back onto the practice field on Sunday, got 2 or 3 practices in, and then flew out to California. And now just have to figure it out on the fly. It's going to be really interesting to watch this one unfold, and I think when you talk about Miami in particular, I think that's probably the biggest team to talk about here. They're one of those teams that you just worry about throughout the whole entirety of the year. I think they're an elite team. I think they have every ability to make the playoff, win the ACC, go on to possibly compete for a national title. They're also a team that's introducing a lot of new players. They're also a team that's relying on a lot of those new players to make a big-time effect in this game. Maybe they just start a little bit slow, and maybe they make people a little bit more nervous about those games coming up with teams going out to Stanford, teams going out to Cal, going out to UCLA, USC, and Washington and Oregon over in the Big Ten. I think it's one of those things that we just haven't really been able to test. So this week is kind of like that guinea pig. It's kind of figuring out, where Miami is, where Virginia Tech is, where all of these teams are, and how big of an effect this travel thing really does have on college football. It's going to be really hard to figure out what that is as of right now, but I think it's one of those things that we'll look back at the end of the week and say, Miami barely escaped, Virginia Tech might have taken a loss, maybe Michigan took a loss, and we're looking up and saying, maybe we should bump up those points just a little bit more if they're going on the road and playing a big-time game, especially all the way out west. And then you got some teams that just have to bounce back in the biggest possible way. I think the biggest one is obviously Georgia. You had a game last week that you just didn't look like Georgia to me, especially in that first half, obviously. Didn't remotely look like what Georgia is. They didn't play elite defense on that back end, and Auburn's going to do everything in their power to expose that back end if they can. I think it's one of those things that Auburn doesn't really have another way forward, frankly. They have to be able to beat you over top. If Georgia plays the defense they played last week, Cam Coleman and friends can absolutely have a day in this one. And then you got Ole Miss. I think when you talk about a bounce back, it's got to be huge for this team. There is not an ability to go in there and eke out a 1-point win and look really ugly doing it and make people feel confident in you on Monday. You absolutely have to go into that tough environment, get a big-time win, maybe win by 10, 14 points. Just prove that you are who we thought you were. Prove that you are the team that came into this year with all the talent in the world, maybe one of the most talented rosters in the country, a third-year starter, all of the weapons, a coach that felt like he was turning a corner in his career. Prove that that's still the case. Prove it's not, one of those seasons kind of like Florida State where you just show up and get really disappointed early on, and then you're looking at the rest of the schedule with a little bit of dread in your eyes. So it's going to be really interesting to watch this team this upcoming weekend, and frankly, the biggest thing that you'll learn is just the mental toughness of this team and the leadership on that team. Then we got a Louisville team that is really, really interesting this upcoming weekend. I think when you talk about this game against SMU, there's not an ability to really bounce back, but not all the way. You had a Notre Dame game last week where you made just way too many mistakes. There were a number of things where you make one less mistake, you make a couple less mistakes in that game, you probably come out on the right side, and then you have all the momentum going into this one. But you didn't. You definitely took a big-time loss, and SMU is going to come in there, and they're playing really good football right about now, especially on the offensive side of the ball. You're going to have to be ready to roll in this one. No two ways about that. And then you got some others. I think Miami, after that weird performance against Virginia Tech, want to see more from that back end of that defense for sure. Arkansas, after a huge loss, looking for a huge win against Tennessee. And then, obviously, you got Washington just trying to bounce back from that title game against Michigan. So we'll see what happens in that one. Going to be a really, really fun weekend. And I think it's going to be defined by a lot of the mental toughness, a lot of the leadership on these teams. Then we got to talk about the Heisman, and it's maybe the most fun race that we've had in quite some time. Really one of the more fun races that I've ever witnessed, at least into 5 weeks. We'll get to the end, the finish line at some point, but at the end of the day, I think when you talk about this, Ashton Jeanty is doing things that are just downright unreal. I believe his line for this upcoming weekend for his rushing yards is 199.5. That's absurd. That should never be a line for a running back for rushing yards in a game. It's absolutely insane what he's able to do up there in Boise, Idaho right now. And I don't care if he plays in the Mountain West. Watch this guy play and tell me he is not a front runner for the Heisman. He should be at the very least number 2 on your list. And if he's number 2, this is your number 1. This is the best player in college football. He's an absolute monster. One of those guys that every time he steps on the field, he does something that I don't think should be physically possible by a kid that age. He is outright incredible. I don't know if y'all saw the video of him playing basketball this week, but yeah, he's a freak. He's a freak athlete in every single sense of the word. He is not built the same as we are. He is absolutely incredible, and he's one of those players that you really don't get to see very often. So soak it all in, enjoy this one, because this guy is special, and he's not going to be around for too much longer. Then you got Jalen Milroe, and I think when you talk about this kid, there were so many worries about him last year. There were so many things that you could poke holes in and worry about. the reality is he's playing great football. He's throwing the ball really efficiently. He's running all over the field as he is, and he's pretty much what Kirby Smart described him as. He's one of the best running backs in the country that can also throw a 50-yard deep ball on the money. He's as dangerous as it gets, and he's taken a big-time stride this year. And then you have Cam Ward, one of the best shows in the entire sport down there in Miami. He's incredible. He's one of those guys that anywhere he is on the field, you feel like he can score a touchdown. He almost did when he was getting tackled. He just shuttled the ball out, and his tight end almost took it to the house. He's incredible in every sense of the word. He is so much fun to watch. Does make a couple of mistakes here and there, but at the end of the day, he's a very, very fun player. Took another step forward in his development this year, and he's going to be tons of fun to watch. And you got other guys, Quinn Ewers, Miller Moss, Nico Imaliava could have a huge week this week. Jackson Dart could bounce back. There's so many players to watch in this Heisman race, and I think when it comes down to it, those top four are about as good as I've ever seen them. They're so much fun to watch. It's really, really cool to have three different positions represented, obviously, and I think it's one of those that it's going to come down to the wire, and it's going to be really fun to watch it do that. But this upcoming week is just all over the place. I think when you talk about all of the different questions you have going into this one, it's even hard to come up with the questions because you don't know where it's going to hit you from. You don't know where this weekend's going to go crazy, but we'll take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to get into my best bets. We're going to get into my picks for this upcoming weekend. I think there's a lot out there. There's not a lot that I feel super confident in because of how chaotic this week could be, but we'll break down the ones that I do like right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about all of the questions I have going into this week. Probably could have gone a little bit further just because of how weird this week is going to be, but let's get into my best bets for this upcoming weekend. I think, I think when you look at this slate, there's a number ones that you feel pretty good about, and then you talk yourself out of it. Or you talk yourself into one, and then you end up betting it, and you feel a little bit weird about it. But at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a really fun week, and I think there's bets out there to be had. And I think the biggest one, really my favorite one of the entire weekend, is Georgia Tech -9 against Duke. I think you talk about this Duke team going into the season, they've done a really, really good job of just winning games. They haven't necessarily done it very pretty, to be totally honest with you. They've only won 2 games by more than 6 points, and that was Elon and Middle Tennessee State. So not necessarily a murderer's row by any means for Duke. I think they're one of those teams that have been able to execute thus far. It's a huge step up in competition coming up this weekend. I think they play a Georgia Tech team that does a really good job of just mixing things up. They're going to make it really hard for that defense to get really any beat on what they're doing offensively. And when you're a Duke team that doesn't have elite athletes all over the field, kind of like Louisville does or did a week ago when they played Georgia Tech, you're going to have a tough time. And I think it's one of those things that Jamal Haynes did not get going in the Louisville game. I'm having a very hard time expecting him to not get going in this one. I think he's going to be an absolute problem for Duke to deal with. And I think the other part of it, Duke hasn't gone on the road yet this year. And I think it's one of those places that obviously Bobby Dodd is not a massive, terrifying environment. It's also going to be a little bit tougher for this team to deal with. Malik Murphy going on the road for the first time as the Duke quarterback. I just think it's a lot to deal with. Maybe you get a number of points in this game, but I think Georgia Tech takes a little bit of an advantage, at least wins by 10 points here. Then I like the Georgia-Auburn over 52.5. I think this game in particular, Georgia's offense just needs to start faster. I don't necessarily expect them to start super fast. They have to be able to put up points in the first quarter. They've been dominated in the first quarter this year. They very badly need to get better in that respect. And I think the biggest thing here for me, Georgia's not going to show mercy in this one. They are not going to take their foot off the gas because they are so frustrated from what happened a week ago. They are not going to take their foot off the gas. They are going to absolutely bury them. I mean, coming off an upsetting loss to a rival, you get to play another rival at home. I think they're going to do everything they can to score 50, 60 points, just absolutely bury this team. Obviously, not put their players in danger by any means, but definitely, twist the scale just a little bit. Twist that knife just a little bit. And then for Auburn, I think you're going to have to hit big plays. There's the only way you're going to win this game is going over the top, hitting Keandre Lambert-Smith, hitting Cam Coleman, Perry Thompson, all of these guys that you are very, very talented, have every ability to be big-time players. you're going to have to hit at least a couple of those plays. I tend to believe they're going to hit one or two. I think the Georgia back end is solid. I don't think they're quite where they need to be, and I think Auburn has at least enough dudes to score some points in this one. Frankly, I think Georgia's going to be carrying quite a bit of the weight here, but I think Auburn will do enough to bump it over that 52.5 marker. I do like SMU +7 against Louisville, and this is one that I've kind of gone back and forth a bit throughout this week, but Louisville was a lot. I think there were a number of mistakes that happened within that Louisville game against Notre Dame that could make you think, well, they just don't have to make those mistakes this upcoming weekend, and they'll be more than fine. I don't think SMU is a team that you're going to be able to just totally get right against, I guess is the best way to put it. I think when you have this offense against of Louisville that had gone through the first couple of weeks very unscathed, play a Georgia Tech team that, frankly, Georgia Tech had every ability to be in that game. They got a blocked kick that went Louisville's way that very much changed the outcome of that one. And then you played a Notre Dame team where you made a number of mistakes again. You put the ball on the ground way too many times. You, I think, got picked off at least twice in that game. SMU is going to cause you problems on the offensive side of the ball, and frankly, if you're going to give them some short fields, they're going to put 7 on the board. They're a very dangerous offensive team, and I think it's just one of those things that I don't think Louisville is going to be able to pull away from them. I think they might be able to win. I think SMU is going to win, but I think it's going to be a really fun back and forth matchup. I just don't think Louisville has the dudes to really pull away in this matchup, especially running the ball. I think it's going to be really tough for them to get at least enough going offensively to keep up with this SMU offense. I do like SMU to get this win and cover the spread, obviously. Then we got Pitt -2, or 2.5, excuse me. I can't understand where this line came from, and that makes me a little bit nervous, to be totally honest with you, but at the end of the day, Pitt has been downright awesome this year. They're one of the best offenses in the country. They're doing incredible things. Eli Holstein is doing just awesome things at the quarterback position, and we don't really know what UNC is. They just got absolutely torched at home by JMU, then lost a really tough game in a rivalry game against Duke. I think it's just one of those defenses just not very good. I don't think they have the ability to keep up with all the stuff that Pitt does on that back end. Kanata Mumfield, very dangerous player that I don't think UNC is going to have an answer for. And I think UNC might just have to score 50 points in this game if they don't want to get beat by the spread. So Pitt's one of the hottest teams in the country. Maybe I'm falling into a little bit of a trap here, but I'm more than happy to do that. I think Pitt's an elite team, and I think they have every ability to keep things going. They're coming off a bye. UNC's coming off a tough loss that I don't think they're equipped to really bounce back from, especially with all of the stuff happening in that locker room right now. Going to be a really, really fun game, and if Pitt can keep it rolling, they are a very dangerous team going forward in the ACC. I like South Carolina to cover the spread against Ole Miss. I just don't really like this Ole Miss team. I got to be totally honest with you guys. I think it's one of those teams that I came into the year so excited about. I think they had so much talent coming in from the transfer portal. Obviously, Jackson Dart, obviously Trey Harris, all of the weapons they had. The thing is, the game last week, it showed all of the things that I was worried about for this team. The lack of physicality on the offensive line, mental errors that let Kentucky stay in that game, and then the inability, to just work through the punches. You're going to get punched in the face every single week in the SEC. There is not a reality where you won't. You're going to have to be able to handle it every single week. And frankly, you're going to get punched in the face the second you step into that stadium because those fans are going to have it out for you. I can absolutely promise you that, especially Juice Wells on that Ole Miss side. It's going to be a lot to deal with. I don't think they have the ability to deal with it. I don't know if they have the leadership in that locker room that they very much need in this game, and I just don't think they have, or they're going to be able to get the offense going the way that they need to. I think they're a good offense. I think they're being a little bit one-dimensional right now. If they don't unlock that run game, which is going to be tough to do against South Carolina, it could be another long day. I do think it's one of those that Ole Miss has every ability to win. I look at it and I can't figure out a reason why Ole Miss is going to win this game by multiple scores and go on to get a big-time win in this one. And this is one of the reasons. I do think we hit the under in this Ole Miss-South Carolina game. 53.5 is the line there. And it's one of those things. I just talked about the aggressive pass rush of South Carolina. It's going to be a nightmare. And it's going to be one of those things that Ole Miss is not going to want to make a lot of mistakes. They're not going to want to give South Carolina life, especially in front of this home crowd. I think it's just one of those things that if this pass rush can get home a couple of times and slow down this offense just a little bit, it's going to be really tough for Ole Miss to really bounce back the way that they need to. And then the other issue is South Carolina, to be totally fair. You have a quarterback position that is still kind of up in the air. It sounds like Lenora Sellers will be going, but it's a little bit kind of all over the place right now. Robbie Ashford was able to get a win for them against Akron. he won't be able to get a win for them in this one. I can almost promise you that. So very badly want Lenore Sellers to go in this one if you're a South Carolina fan. But at the end of the day, I think South Carolina is going to follow the Kentucky model. I think they have every ability to do that. I think they have every ability to just slow this game down, run the ball with Rocket Sanders and Lenore Sellers, just make life really tough for Ole Miss to get really anything going. And then you look up in the third quarter and it's 17-10, and it's a very low scoring game. They're battling it out, and it's a couple of plays that are going to make all the difference in this one. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a slugfest, especially in the first half. I don't think there's going to be much of anything going for either of these offenses. And then we got Michigan-Washington under 41.5. This might be one of the grossest games of the week, guys. But at the end of the day, it is a title rematch, which sounds crazy to say, even 9 months removed from it. But here we are. I think this Michigan offense against the linebackers that Washington has is not necessarily the greatest matchup in the world. I think it's a little bit closer to what they faced against Texas than what they faced the rest of the year. And I do like the USC linebackers. I think when you talk about Carson Bruner, Tutupala, it's going to be really tough for this Michigan team to really get what they want to get going on the ground. I think Michigan running the ball is not going to be a problem the rest of the year. I feel pretty confident saying that. But I do think there's an ability where you hold them to 100 yards on the ground, 120, 150 on the ground, you're probably doing enough. If they're going to throw for 83 yards in the air, you're going to be doing plenty if you're holding them to 150 on the ground. So Washington doesn't have to be spectacular in this one by any means. I think we all understand no one has to be spectacular against Michigan to get that win. But at the end of the day, on the other side, Washington's offense I just don't really like. And I know they're finding a little bit of groove. I know Will Rogers is kind of getting things going. You scored 21 points against Rutgers. You're probably not scoring 21 points against Michigan. Let's be totally honest. I think it's going to be an absolute battle. Josiah Stewart is turning into an absolute game wrecker coming off the edge, and then that elite defensive line is doing exactly what they should be doing, which is taking over pretty much every game they play in. So I wouldn't be surprised if we looked up and Washington had 6 points in this game. I think it's going to be really, really tough for them to get going. I think the Washington defense knows they're going to have to play probably their best football they've played all year to win this one, and then Michigan's defense knows the exact same thing because they know that very well at this point. So it's going to be a really tough battle. I think we could look up at halftime of this game. It's 10-3, and no one has much of anything going offensively. So it's going to be a little bit of a rock fight. Obviously not necessarily the rematch that we expected to get, but here we are. I think it's still going to be a really fun one, just a little bit of a battle in the trenches. Then I love this Indiana team minus 14 against Northwestern. Yet another one where I might be falling into a trap, kind of like that Pitt game, but 14 just doesn't feel like enough. Indiana's so good, so well coached, so good at going into places that they should be taking care of business, and they do. We saw UCLA a couple of weeks ago, 42-13. They handled everything the way that they need to, and frankly, the rest of their schedule is very, very favorable. They have every ability to go into this game, get a big-time win, and then things get really interesting in a hurry. So it's going to be a really fun game. I think Northwestern is just not really anything offensively, frankly. Cam Porter has a little bit going. He's one of those dangerous players on that team. Not much else. I don't think there's much else that Indiana really has to worry about, and I think Indiana's in a spot where they could do exactly what they did to UCLA a couple of weeks ago. It's going to be a fun matchup, one of those that could sneak up on me. Maybe I'm getting lulled into a false sense of security here, but I think Indiana might win by 35 points in this game. I think they might just dominate, and Northwestern is comfortably the worst team in this conference. So it's going to be really fun to watch these unfold. I think best bets this week is going to be really tough to come by. I think there's a lot of games that could go either direction. There's a couple of games that maybe you feel pretty good about one spread and then you talk yourself right out of it. So it's going to be a really interesting matchup. Going to be really, really fun to watch these unfold. But let's take our final break here. And when we come back, we're going to break down all the headlines we haven't got to throughout the week. The biggest one came in the recruiting world and it came around the Auburn football program. Absolutely huge commitment for them. But we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about my best bets heading into this weekend. A tough week to put together, no two ways about that, just because of all the chaos that I tend to believe is going to happen. But let's get into a little bit of a headline catch-up, because there's a number of things that happened this week that we just haven't had a chance to get to. Obviously, a huge week in college football, so I wanted to make sure I covered all the games for you guys, but let's get into this, and let's start with Deuce Knight, a huge commitment for Auburn. He has flipped from Notre Dame to Auburn. He did that on Wednesday. One of those things that you kind of been waiting for this one for quite some time. I don't necessarily think he was committed for that time, but he very well might have been. There's some rumors that he has been kind of at least with Auburn for quite some time. He is officially now with them. He is now committed, and Auburn jumps LSU with number 3 in the recruiting class for the 2025 class. They're doing everything that you could possibly want them to do to set themselves up for a good future in the Hugh Freeze era. There's a lot of questions, obviously, going forward, but at the end of the day, this is a huge commitment. It puts you in a really, really good place going forward. I still tend to believe they'll go get a quarterback from the portal after this year, but when you have Walker White, when you have Deuce Knight in that quarterback room, you have to feel a little bit better about the future of Auburn football. I think it's one of those that Hugh Freeze needed his guy very badly down there, and I think he's finally got it. So it's going to be really fun to watch this one unfold. I think it's one of those players that very well could walk in and win that job. I would be a little bit skeptical of that happening, but you watch this kid play, it's not crazy that it would happen by any means. Very interested to see what this means for Hugh Freeze going forward. We'll see how quickly he gets on the field, but a huge commitment for him nonetheless. Then I want to talk about the Super League here for a second. I know we've talked about this during the offseason, but they officially have some plans. They've gone out and released their 12 conferences that they're going to put out there. It's 12 6-team conferences, 72 programs up top, and then you got 64 group of 5 programs. They're going to be broken into 8 different conferences of 8 apiece. They will be able to go up in promotion and relegation, and that will be a part of this. Frankly, I don't know if this is one you really have to worry about, at least as of right now. Obviously, if the money gets right, then a lot of things can happen in a hurry. But as of right now, I don't think it's necessarily something that we really have to concern ourselves with too much. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it develops, obviously, and we'll see what happens with it. But as of right now, there doesn't seem like there's many people biting on this, at least in the camp that you very much need them to. But obviously, it could change in a hurry if a certain amount of money is waved in front of certain people's faces. But we'll get to that when we get there. Maybe we'll break it down in a little bit more detail next week, but as of right now, I just wouldn't necessarily stress myself out too much about this one. Then we got a little bit of an expansion update. This is something that I want to talk about here for a second. The Pac-12 sounds like it's taken a little bit of a step back. They have gotten to, I believe, 8 teams when they added Gonzaga. Oh, that's not a full-time team. So they still have to add some teams. They'll still have to figure that out, and we'll get to a couple of candidates here in a second. But it sounds like they're taking a little bit of a step back to figure out all of the media rights deals, and they badly need to do that because it kind of felt like Pac-12 was just ramping up, getting all of these teams feeling great about where they were, and then they were going to look up and say, we need money coming in. And finally, they have done that. So we'll see what happens with this one. I think they're in a relatively good spot. I think adding Gonzaga obviously gives you a basketball product that can rival really anyone in the country. You have Gonzaga, you have San Diego State over there, you have some really, really good teams that are going to be really fun to watch. So I think they have enough to sell. I do think they're not necessarily going to be anywhere near where they need to be in the Power 4 conversation, but at the end of the day, I think they've done enough to at least give themselves a lifeline. So really good work by Teresa Gould and all the people over there, and we'll see who they add next, and it could be Sacramento State. I know how that sounds absolutely insane, and Sacramento State could very easily go to the Mountain West as well. They're trying to raise $50 million in NIL because they know that will get people's attention. They've already gotten 35 in the books. They're doing really, really incredible things over there in Sacramento, and then you add in the media market, you add in all of the other stuff that goes into that team, maybe they have more of a chance to jump up to the Power 4 level than I thought they would. I think it's one of those that I very much peg them as a Mountain West, if anything else, and maybe that's still the case, but as of right now, it could be really, really interesting to see what Sacramento State does going forward. And then we got some news out of the Mountain West, and mainly around a team that doesn't seem to be coming to the Mountain West, at least as of right now. It sounds like Texas State will stay put in the Sun Belt for now. It doesn't sound like that's going to be very long term, if I'm being totally honest with you, but at the end of the day, it sounds like the Sun Belt is more than happy, or Texas State is more than happy in the Sun Belt, and I don't expect them to move at least soon. I think obviously a lot of things can change, but the Sun Belt's a very, very consistent, confident product, and I wouldn't necessarily be super worried if I was a team in that area right now. So huge decision by them, and obviously kind of perturbs some of this realignment that we absolutely hate. So that's always good news. But I got to talk about these jerseys, guys. I know this is a little bit less important than the rest of the stuff we're talking about, but when you talk about elite jerseys, Western Kentucky's got them all. And this one's going to happen next week against UTEP, so be on the lookout for that. But these are absolutely elite in every way, and man, these helmets are cool. It's absolutely awesome when they get Big Red involved in this one. It is going to be a red out. It's going to be incredible to watch this one unfold. I'm going to tune into this game just for the helmets. I think WKU should be able to win very comfortably against UTEP. I don't care. I'm going to be tuned in, very, very excited to see these on full display. And when I saw them come across my Twitter page, I very much had to put it in the show. So then we'll get to Chez Mellusi, and this is a very interesting story. It sounds like he is going to leave the Wisconsin team to heal from some injuries that he's suffered throughout this year. Very, very interesting. It's one of those things that he's already used his redshirt season. If he wanted to come back to college football, which very likely will be the case, he's going to have to produce medical documentation that shows it prevented him from playing this year. So we'll see what happens with that. Obviously, a lot of things to happen with this saga. Kind of a weird thing, though. I don't know how many times people have seen this outside of me. I haven't seen it very often. A player that gets injured and then walks away from his team. Now, not necessarily going after Chez Mellusi in any way, because I do understand being around your team can make that recovery a little bit harder mentally because you very badly want to be out there on the field. So don't fault the kid by any means. That being said, it is kind of interesting. Going forward through the offseason, let's say, if Chez Mellusi were to leave Wisconsin, would there be more to this story? Would we start to revisit it and be like, maybe this was a little bit deeper than we thought at the time being? Or he comes back to Wisconsin and obviously, does incredible things. They feel great about him going forward. But it's just one of those things that I don't really get a beat on. I don't really have an idea of why he would leave, or why, Wisconsin obviously should let him leave. But at the end of the day, it's very, very interesting to see this unfold, and could be one of those stories that we revisit in the offseason after Chez Mellusi signed with someone totally different and see what's going on in Wisconsin. But as of right now, not necessarily super worried about this from Wisconsin's perspective. Obviously, he was not going to be on the field anyway. That being said, Tawi Walker just became a hugely important player for this team. If he can get that run game going without Chez Mellusi, then you're at the very least can keep this season alive for Wisconsin. Just kind of a weird season up there in Madison. But then we'll move on to Graham Harrell. He has been let go by Purdue. He was the offensive coordinator for the last 2 years. They started 1-4 this year, averaged 23.9 points per game in 2023. So was okay, but at the end of the day, only scored 20 points in the Big Ten 3 times. So very badly needed to make a change here. I think when you look at the last couple of weeks, not necessarily hard to figure out. Hudson Card had logged his 3rd straight game with fewer than 200 passing yards. The Boilermakers only rushed for 50 yards while averaging 1.6 yards per carry. Just can't happen. I fully understand. I think Graham Harrell's a relatively good offensive coordinator. I think he'll have an ability to get back up into these ranks and possibly go down to the group of 5 level and then make his way back up. Just one of those things. It didn't necessarily work out here. It'll be really interesting to see what this rest of the season looks like for Purdue. They have a big one against Wisconsin this upcoming weekend, and maybe they can prove a little bit of a point. Maybe they can put up crazy numbers offensively and totally put the stuff behind them. I very much doubt that that'll be the case. I think the personnel-wise is just not nearly where it needs to be, honestly, for Purdue to succeed. And frankly, I have a hard time thinking Graham Harrell was ever really going to succeed there. But that's a totally side conversation for another day. Ryan Walters is going to have his hands full for the rest of the season. We'll see how he handles all of this and how they move forward. But definitely something that they did not intend to happen at this point in the year. And then we got to talk about Greg Sankey. It sounds like he is not really in favor of a college football commissioner coming into the fray. Imagine that. Craziest thing in the world, right? The guy that is the most powerful man in the sport doesn't want a more powerful man to come into the sport. It's a crazy idea, but it's one of those things that not necessarily surprised by any means. I don't think it should change anything by any means. It's obviously a huge vote that they very much need to have, but at the end of the day, you get all the other votes, you probably have enough ability to get Greg Sankey as well. So it's going to be a little bit of a battle to figure out who the leader of this sport can be, who they're going to be able to sign off on. Frankly, if it was Nick Saban standing up there, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone that was going to vote against him, whether that was fear or actually thinking that it was going to be good. Regardless, I think a lot of people would vote for Nick Saban to take over this job. I don't think Nick Saban wants this job. So we're going to have to figure out who it's going to be. Obviously going to be a very lengthy and tough process to figure out because there are a lot of people that would want this job that wouldn't want it for the right reasons. So we're going to have to figure out who that team is going to be. But at the end of the day, I could care less what Greg Sankey has to say about this. I know he's a very powerful man in the sport and absolutely will have something to say about what this is going forward. But of course he doesn't want a commissioner. Of course he doesn't want a centralized governing body, because as of right now, he's pretty much the centralized governing body. Him and the Big Ten are as comfortable as you possibly could be. He is the most powerful man in the sport, and he just doesn't want to give up his perch. So I understand it from his perspective, to be totally fair. I also don't necessarily care from his perspective. I very much want a commissioner in the sport. I very much want a centralized governing body, and I want both of those things to actually do the things for the players and the fans that have not been done in the past. So it'll be obviously interesting to see how that unfolds. I think when you talk about the sport in general right now, there are about a million things. We'll be interested to see how it unfolds, and will have a lot to do with what the future of the sport is, and that commissioner position might be number one. But if it is up to Greg Sankey, he is not going to have that happen. So we'll see what happens on that front. Definitely going to be a really fun weekend this upcoming weekend. Definitely strap in. It's one of those weeks that you could very easily get lulled into a false sense of security, and then you have incredible games all over the place. So be careful. Make sure you get all your TVs going this upcoming weekend. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Thank you so much for listening. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. I will see you on Monday to break down this crazy week, but thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys then.